broad points: reducing carbon footprints, driving green innovation, financing sustainable growth, building resilient supply chains, and embracing circular economy solutions. Join us as we confront the climate crisis head-on and explore opportunities for sustainable growth. Our panel will share expertise, inspire action, and equip you with tools to make a real impact. Let's turn the tide of climate change together. The time for action is now. First, we would like to invite Ms. Julie Greene, Chief Sustainability Officer at Olam International. With a career spanning 20 years across Africa and Asia, Ms. Greene champions responsible private sector development as a means to socio-economic progress. At Olam, she spearheads the 2030 sustainability goals and strategies across its multiple businesses and geographies. Let's hear from Ms. Greene on the insights and views on how sustainability can be built into the supply chain to positively impact on livelihoods. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Ken Bellamy, Chairman of VRM Biologik. Ken established VRM Biologik in 1987 to offer a practical, natural alternative to the kill everything clean practices that have dominated food production and water management. Since then, VRM Biologik's patented processes have gained global recognition for their capacity to resolve a range of industrial and agricultural problems. He will be touching on examples of how investing on solutions to transform biodiversity, such as soil, can have an impact on the ecosystem. Mr. Bellamy, please. And now we will invite Mr. Russel for his views. He has worked in one of the leading teams for climate change globally, assisting with commercial, legal, and regulatory issues in transactions in the carbon markets, as well as environmental products. His work in the carbon market saw him acting as lead external counsel for Verra, the administrator of the largest voluntary carbon standard globally, for 2 years, where he dealt with all aspects of work in the carbon markets. In this segment, he will share more about how impact investing and green financing can be enablers to this change. I'll leave you now to this panel.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And I want to thank each and every one of you who are here, excellencies, honored guests, and impact makers, and everyone who's actually here in the room, because I'm aware that it is getting on to that stage of the day where lunch starts calling. However, we have a very, very powerful panel here, because one of the challenges of this whole space of will we have a future worth living? I have a quick question for all of you who are here. How many of you would like to be alive in 26 years? Excellent. I'm so pleased. Yes, with me. And I ask this question because some people, when we talk about this whole idea of 2050, it feels like a long time away. And some number that's out there. 26 years is actually 2050. And I have a very easy marker for what 26 years looks like. My mother is 26 years older than me. I have the privilege of her still being here. She does yoga twice a week. She plays tennis. She plays a mean game of bridge. And she's a fantastic cook and mum. And I like to think that the work that each and every one of us here does in our roles, and particularly this panel does around sustainability, will create a world that each of us are happy to be living in another 26 years. So with that as a starting point, the question we decided to explore on this panel is the role that investment is making around sustainability, and where we have success stories and what is creating that success. Because some groups we hear saying that there's not enough funding going into sustainability-based projects, and the lack of capital is one of the key constraints to the climate transition that we're going under. Others say there's plenty of capital and there's a lack of investable opportunities. And so what we've decided to do today is gather three fabulous people to explore three different elements of this challenge. Russel comes in from the point of view and universe of the investor and capital. Julie comes in from the point of view of the CSO, who's got the mandate looking at what will create sustainability beyond the commercials. and particularly with the work in Olam, she's got some other lenses that she's going to be adding in. And Ken comes in from the perspective of someone who's not only creating an impact, but also what does it take to go and craft this entrepreneurial journey, particularly through the scale-up stage of moving not from something that's simply proven, but actually to something that can create a greater impact very rapidly globally. Again, all things that over the next 26 years we're going to be incredibly grateful for, and for anyone who has a 2030 target, which is only 6 years away, oh my God, it's getting close. Each and every one of them has very, very powerful insights for us. Now we're going to start with the pointy end of it, the money question. Russell, you're sitting there looking very relaxed and innocent. I want to also say thank you very much to Singapore and NS for giving you leave to be here today, because as everyone here would appreciate, in Singapore men do their 2 weeks a year, and the system has gratefully allowed you to be able to be here and with us. You were sharing some of your experience in what's actually created successful large-scale collaborations and investments into needle-moving sustainability investments that have high ROI, i.e. it hits both dials. What can you share with this group that's made a real difference, and what would be powerful risks for them to overcome in making those moves?
Thank you for having me today. Thank you, I thank the Excellencies for being here as well as being on the panel. So I think the answer is quite simple. It's about finance, right? Sustainability, just like what we heard earlier about school being set up in Saudi Arabia, it's all about investments. And it's about having the right risk appetite for those investments. And it's about making sure that the risk appetites are being catered for and the right risk is being allocated. I think we've started the whole sustainability topic at COP26 in 2021, where there was, in the light of the pandemic, a focus on, we all need to go green and we need to be net zero. But I think we've forgotten that finance is going to be the one that drives us to that destination.
It's fuel in the vehicle, isn't it?
Well,
the question is, what sort of fuel?
Right. So I think in that sense, it's more about having the right risk allocation so that you attract the right investments. And I think capital is out there. Right? I think, to be completely candid, it's no longer the days of free money, where we saw in the last couple of years, but there is capital.
Okay, so could you expand on the risk appetite and the fact that money is no longer free and how that's changed availability?
So I think the best example of how it's no longer free money, I'll address that part first, is in the past you used to be able to have VC funds go out and invest in a slew of climate technologies itself. And in recent years, you've seen that change. People are drawing back capital. So it's not because capital isn't there. It's just that the atmosphere is no longer adequate for that investment to continue. With higher interest rates itself as a good example.
So adequate, just because not everyone here is in the finance world, so just helping us translate that into adequate, meaning it's not creating a financial return that's sufficient to support this, or is there other criteria going in there?
So I think what is adequate can be divided into two broad segments. First one being adequate from a financial return perspective. Everyone needs to, make a return in that sense. And secondly, adequate from a regulatory standpoint. What do I mean by that? So it needs to have the right infrastructure out there in order to make those investments. So give you an example of what a right regulatory setup would be. And that would be in Asia Pacific, we've got Haneda Airport having 10% of requirement for sustainable aviation fuel. You have the same, which is 1% in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, starting in 2026. And those are a regulatory setup that would then fuel the aviation industry to actually go out and procure sustainable aviation fuel. And
that's in essence a market-making move.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we do see market-making moves across different countries, but they're not targeted or they're not coordinated in a sense where you can then create scale. It's done on an ad hoc level. And I think from where we sit on the investment side of things, it's really about identifying which regulatory system provides or facilitates that investment best. So capital is there. It's just who provides the best kind of atmosphere in order for you to make the best returns.
So this is where their excellencies become such a powerful influencer.
Well, I think I should hope so. And I do see a lot of the countries that are being represented here today making different moves. So you have it in, for example, in Saudi, where they just mentioned about how they have already reached 10% of in terms of renewable energy and looking to do it but in 4 years' time to hit 50%. But those are lofty targets. It's about the right setup that would allow for you to then invest to actually then reach those goals. So you would see that a lot of countries have already set those goals, but it's about the execution, right? It's about having the right setup, the right platform that allows for foreign investors to come in, to make those investments, to de-risk those projects, to allow banks to then finance those projects. Because at the end of the day...
So there's quite a layer of dominoes. So
Yes.
from the point of view of, say, COP29, even when, as that works through, there's still these other dominoes that need to be set up so that they can fall in the right sequence.
Exactly.
Okay, now we've only got a minute or two before we're going to move across onto Julie and some other perspectives there. Could you share some of your insights on the structure that you put in place in Africa that started moving a couple of needles? Because it's an unusual it was a very unusual setup, and I don't want to misrepresent it, because it was a very, very powerful collaboration between a whole series of different companies who set up an unusual commercial structure that's created a very, very significant outcome, but on both accounts of the business and the environment, and socially as well, when you were sharing it with me.
Yep. So it's actually in Southeast Asia, so it's much closer to home than...
Right on our doorstep.
Right on our doorstep. And actually it's a biodiversity collective that was developed. It's called the Rimba Collective. And part of that was how would you actually pay for those outcomes without being part of CSR. And this was a collaboration with the largest FMCG companies that came together to actually determine that, well, we cannot stop using palm oil because that's not possible. What we instead do is to ensure that that becomes counted within our financial metrics in the form of penalties. So it's an industry-led coordinated effort in that sense, where the higher the use of your palm oil, that would then contribute to a higher amount of penalties that you will pay. And then that translates into investments that would be, the penalties would be used as investments to actually conserve and prevent deforestation itself. So with that, again, how that worked is it forced the hands of the FMCG companies to think at the supply chain level, which I believe Julie would share a little bit more in a bit, and also across their entire structure itself. How would we internalize this as a cost? It's about internalizing the externality itself. And I think if you take a step back and look at what governments have done, the Singapore carbon tax is a good example of internalizing that state cost itself. It's to force companies to do so, because at the end of the day, companies focuses on having shareholders, stakeholders' returns. And only when you internalize such costs would you then actually move the needle and change the mindset in order for them to invest into more sustainable practices.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, and the fact that it was a voluntary association collectively put together by an industry with hard commercial legal rules to enforce, encourage, and require compliance. It was quite unusual. Now, Julie, we want to move across. Thank you very much, Russell. I want to move across to you. When we were speaking on the call the other day, one of the key things that stood out to me was the whole appreciation that the work of biodiversity and the importance of community makes into being able to create a long-term sustainable business and society often is undervalued. And the work that you've been doing both here and other parts of the world has sort of been living and breathing, moving that and improving that for a really long time. Can you share what you've seen that creates power and value against these multiple dimensions?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the size of what we need to do in food and agri in order to feed the world is huge. You were saying just a moment ago, we're coming into lunch. We're all hungry. We want to be living until 2050. Well, we're going to need to grow. Estimates say anywhere between 50% to 100% more food to feed the world between now and then, partially because of population growth, partially because of growing middle class and dietary change.
And that's on the existing farming footprint.
Exactly, because we want to do this without increasing greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, reducing that. And, the investments needed to cut in half emissions from food is estimated to be about $200 billion a year. Similarly, about the same amount is needed to actually increase the food supply from now to then. So what is it that we need to be investing in? What is it that we can do that's going to be sustainable as well as feeding the world and helping to provide jobs and not increase the footprint? So at Olam Agri, we grow, we process, we trade staple commodities, grains, rice, cotton, a variety of different products. And we have significant investments across Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, and really throughout the world. A couple of the key areas that we've really been focusing on lately are regenerative agriculture practices. Because regenerative agriculture, healthy soils, can help to foster improve biodiversity, not just above ground, but below ground as well, feeding that microorganism complex.
Nematodes start becoming fascinating, don't they? Anybody here know what a nematode is? No. Very small creatures that keep the soils very happy.
Yes, and we need this diversity of creatures to support the nutrient uptake by the plants, as well. We need that carbon and plant matter as well in the soil, organic matter in the soil, that helps to reduce the risk of floods as well. It can help to reduce costs through reduction in fertilizer use as well. So maybe just a couple of quick examples. In Thailand, in Ubona Ratchathani, we've been training and supporting some 30,000 rice farmers over the past few years to basically optimize their fertilizer use, to reduce their water use, to implement practices like alternate wetting and drying that have reduced greenhouse gas emissions while increasing their incomes up to 20%.
Can I ask a little bit more around that one? Because, just side story, I grew up at the International Rice Research Institute, so it's a near and dear topic. And that insight on just changing the water levels on rice and what that does to methane levels is material, and because rice contributes something like 8% of the global methane. It's a huge, in the farming contribution to greenhouse gases. It's a huge contributor, and of course we like rice in this part of the world. It's very good, it feeds lots of people. But these sorts of changes are apparently subtle, but have not necessarily been easy to implement. No. What have you found that has helped that part of it? Because there's the money equation, but there's also the social acceptability of some of the changes.
Yeah, it's maybe subtle changes, but I think a lot of it is a question of a behavior change and incentives and understanding how to do it, technological investment. There's a whole variety of things that can help to support farmers' knowledge and ability to implement alternate wetting and drying, which can reduce methane emissions by about half or more coming from rice. For example, we've worked with innovators, including from here, to look at simple devices that help the farmer to measure the water level in the field. You can have your most basic device where you actually go out and you look at a tube that's there. You can also have IoT devices, and it really depends on the farmer. We need to have devices that are suitable, different levels of technology that are suitable for different farmers, for different experiences. On the technology side, another area that we're investing in is technology for post-harvest loss reduction. So that's huge as well, because it's one thing to produce more food, but if we could just not lose the food that's being produced, and it's incredible.
What's the wastage level between, from farm to table? It always blows my mind when I hear the statistics on that.
Yeah, globally, we lose about a third, or we're not eating, we're not consuming about a third of the food that's grown. Now, in the more developed countries, most of that loss is happening at the consumer end, so in the supermarkets and ourselves as consumers wasting the food. In the less developed economies, there's not so much wastage at the consumer end, but most of that is happening at the production and post-production, post-farming and transport. So we have mapped some 10 of our supply chains around the world, and we've looked at the different stages from harvest time, you know, the threshing and winnowing and transport, from the farmer to when it reaches us, to identify where those losses are happening, try to find hotspots, and see if we can introduce technologies, whether it's mechanized harvesters, whether it's simple dry cards that let farmers know their the moisture level before they put their grain in storage, so that so it doesn't mold and rot in storage. And so one of our successes is in wheat and in rice in Nigeria. We found that the harvesting losses were quite high, and we've seen from 17% of a farmer's production lost during harvesting time, we've reduced it to about 2%.
Now that's huge, not just from an environmental point of view, not just from a social food point of view, but also huge economically, because that farmer retained value from that lack of loss.
Exactly, and it also helps us to secure our own supply, so it's win-win.
Okay, I've just had a lovely little clue suggesting what, from the point of view of what you've seen over the last couple of years, what actions are you seeing create the greatest impact? I know that's a really, but you're living and breathing it in many ways. What do you see actually is moving? Because if there's things that other people can pick up and spread out there, that's powerful.
Yeah, I'd love to say there's one silver bullet, but it's not. These are systems. It's really global food and agri systems that need to be tweaked here and there. So from the knowledge and skills and behavior change side, is just as important as having access to those different techniques and technologies. I think that there's some areas where I think more investment is needed into what are the farming systems, like the combination of crops, rather than monocropping, that combination of crops and of cover cropping and rotational cropping and different techniques, and which ones go together to actually bring the best health into the soils, and really looking at multiple impact indicators. The health of the soils is really key for long-term future, but also how does it support the food security and the livelihoods of the farmers who are growing that combination of crops.
Yeah. Which then, thank you very much for that, because it's a beautiful setup. We organized this panel very well. Thank you, Julie, because it also then leads into other value indicators of what does that stability mean then for the local communities and then for the urban communities around. Because I think part of the whole discussion of where is value being created is we stop too soon. The reality is moving dials in these places has massive social value, community value, and economic value in a much broader sphere. And when we don't put that on the table and recognize it, we undervalue the actual investment that's going on. Because one of the changes that I see happening is the choice, and what you talked about, the Rimba Collective highlighted this too, is multiple parties putting in and creating different value. And that value distribution not being in the traditional binary one-to-one about we create this one deal together, we create this one deal together. It's okay, between us all, it all works out. Lots of very, very different collaborative flow of investment and value creation happening. So thank you very much for bringing that expanded one. Now let's move on to soils. How many people like getting their hands dirty with soil? We've got a couple of, I ask, it's always a question, you can tell who the gardeners are in the room, because they put their hands up at this particular one. My father was an agriculturalist. My mother is a keen gardener, so I learned how to get my hands dirty early on. Ken and I were talking earlier about the problem that erosion creates. And for anyone who's seen hills wiped away down to red dust and the funnels that serious erosion makes and what that does, it's a fairly life-changing thing. And I remember my father coming back from Mauritius with photographs, and this is going back into the 70s. So, it's been an issue for a long time. Ken said he saw this about the same time. You can tell he and I are not the youngest vintage. and it started him on his journey. Now, could you have a little bit to share to help people understand the role soils play in the shift? I know you've got a PowerPoint or two, and it's pretty key. Now, I'm going to hand it over to you because there's value in soils, and there's also the security side, and there's the bigger economics.
Thanks very much. So it's been really interesting for me listening in the discussions. Every single one of the presenters so far has mentioned at the end of their presentation, or somewhere in point number 6, 7, 8, in one of it was point number 9, the importance of sustainable food production. It's your number one focus, but in all of the presentation that's come up. We're here talking about opportunities. Opportunities arise when problems arise. Real opportunities come out of a difficult situation. The real story of this planet is that the number of acres of arable land is declining every year, and the number of people eating off that arable land is increasing every year. There are two graphs that appear on the Food and Agriculture website. They look really boring on the website, so we just joined the two of them together. Those two lines have crossed. They're already passed.
Ouch. Ouch.
Those two lines have crossed. The point at which there's not enough land to feed the people that are on it has already passed. Now, in all the discussions, I have yet to hear somebody talk about investing in rebuilding the number one asset of the planet. The number one asset of the planet is the soil. Without the soil, you don't get the food. Without the food, you don't get the humans. Without the humans, you don't get the market that gives you the money to do all the other things that have been talked about. It's a waste of time talking about how to fuel your car if you're not investing in fueling yourself. Now, we saw that back in the early 80s. I commissioned a study because somebody challenged me. I was a financial planner, by the way. I was in the financial world. And I was challenged by a person who was considered a radical, who said, if you are not investing in and teaching your clients to invest in how to look after their environmental responsibilities, you'll be out of business in 10 years and so will they. Now, in the 80s, that wasn't a subject. It is a subject now. I collected a focus group at that time and asked everybody, can you please tell me if you're interested in the environment? If I ask you that question now, are you interested in the environment? Raise your hand if you're interested in the environment. Is there anybody who's not interested in the environment? If I give you $100 today, what will you spend it on that fixes something in the environment? Back then, there weren't that many alternatives. Nobody knew what to do. Now there's lots of alternatives to spend it on, but how many of you, when you thought of spending your $100, thought about building a piece of soil that would feed your children? Do you know how to do it? Do you know how to rebuild the soil so that it is like it was before it started to disappear? We spent 40 years looking at what makes soil, where it comes from, how it is developed naturally, how it appeared before we started using it. A key point in that was to understand the next slide. Soil comes from photosynthesis, but you think it comes from photosynthesis from the bit you can see, which is the bit that grows on top. It doesn't. Soil is built by photosynthesis that happens inside the soil. That was a discovery we had to make. Do you know what the problem is in financing sustainability? People don't know enough about what to finance. It's taken us, it actually took us 20 years before the formula for bacterial photosynthesis, which underpins a different photosynthesis that happens in the soil, and while it's happening, produces water that wasn't there in the first place, and produces carbon structures that build the nutrient content for the plants to grow. That piece has to happen first. Plants don't come first. I did a study really weirdly at 3 in the morning one morning, sitting at my desk. I thought I was nuts. I just did a mass balance on the formula for photosynthesis. a chemical mass balance. The bits that go in and the bits that go out. Every chemical formula is supposed to balance. I discovered that that formula that you've read in your high school, you've read in your university, you've read in every textbook, it's what underpins every piece of human life on the planet, and it doesn't balance. There's a bit missing. The bit that's missing is a phosphorus-generated energy compound that is built by bacterial photosynthesis that nobody had even heard of. 20% of the energy needed to grow a plant comes from outside the plant. It doesn't get it from its own solar panels, it gets fed it by the soil. Now, if you knew that, you would invest in that, right? Because there's a huge knob to turn. How do you invest in building the energy component that rebuilds the soil that builds the plant? How do you do it? We had to go and actually invent the market for it, had to find out how to get in touch with those guys who were doing that, how to look at them, if you can believe. We postulated that that had to be happening, and for the first 15 years we had never seen the guys that do it because there wasn't microscopes that could see them. They were too fast and too small. But that bacterial photosynthesis, get to know it, everybody, because it's what keeps you alive. There was a stage on the planet when there was no water. Have you ever thought of that? We talk about water shortages. We're working in Jordan, in Egypt, in Saudi. We're working in places where there's sand now because there isn't as much water as there was before in the soils. Used to be tropical like it is here. It's not tropical now. There's a piece that's missing in there, that's the water. Why did the water disappear? It's a big question. We discovered that there is a way to rebuild the water supply in the soil that becomes the evaporation, that becomes the rain. The water in the soil doesn't start by falling out of the sky. It starts by this process of bacterial photosynthesis, building that water, making it a hydrogen reactor in the soil that net water produces, and letting that evaporate, and then that creates rain. Would it surprise you to know that cousins of those microorganisms fly up with the water that flies up into the atmosphere, generate electricity in the little tiny droplets, capture bits of dust out of the sky, formulate a particle of ice, and make the rain? Would that surprise you?
That's much more advanced than my kindergarten, high school level of what's going on. But I mean, this is, I think, also the truth of part of the challenge that we have, is there's a lot of science that we don't know. And it's the investment, and thank you very much, Ken, for being willing to put the time and energy into unraveling these sorts of questions, because what's often not spoken about in these whole transitions is there's often a massive legacy of people who've been doing this sort of work. To see a problem, to pull it together. I mean, you've shared a 30-year journey just in the last 5 minutes. And now there's this huge impact journey that's happening as it takes out. Just before we sort of, loop back for another round of questions and sort of moving it into more of a dialogue type structure, what's been the piece that's helped shift from the science side and that insight, which is I cannot... Having grown up in the science world, I know how long that takes, and I know how long it takes to get the science out and then for it to commercialize and then to grow. What's helped that shift? Because that's an indicator for various parties here to be able to take that things, from the science into the scale up, because that's where we're being able to see the global sorts of impact that the work you're doing is now creating.
So what we discovered is that people are never going to understand that, and they're never going to, you can't walk into a banker's office and ask him to invest in that. It's going to take years to go home and research it. His due diligence can't be done because nobody else knows it. Okay. Can't do it. What we had to do was to develop simple, practical tools so that people could implement that process without knowing it. So we had to develop mechanisms and patent methods that people could pick up and say, okay, that's something I can do, and not know.
Okay, so something they can do, they can not know doing that, but also I suppose that means finding opportunities where people can create value simply and rapidly.
Yes.
So that from the investor point of view, it's bankable. because there's the reliability. Because they can do due diligence on that, not necessarily do due diligence on the science, because they've got short-term visible outcomes.
And then what we did was to go and partner with governments. Because, you know...
Thank you, governments.
you know,
All of you in the room. Thank you.
Food is the government's responsibility. Waste is the government's responsibility. The social impacts of security, food security, balance, they're governmental responsibilities. So somebody had to lead without knowing what all the outcomes were. And we partnered with governments that were prepared to do that. And I got to say, there are governments in this room that have looked over the horizon and taken steps that weren't done with complete due diligence, that were done by making a plan and saying we need to get there. Saudi Arabia is a great example of that, saying we want to shoot for that target and going and getting it. And it's a privilege for me to have watched a change in policy come along. Here's a really, really, really important thing that happened in the world. In the 19th People's Congress, a small statement was made. China must pivot away from the use of synthetic and chemical inputs to farms and pivot towards the use of organic and biological inputs to farms. That's a tiny statement with a huge impact on the planet. A similar one came in 2023 when Mr. Blinken articulated a new policy for the US that said, don't depend on food from your neighbour, develop climate-adapted species for yourself. That's a huge change.
That's absolutely, I mean, all these things are absolutely massive, because I also know that by the time one rolls out embeds and scales, we're in, that's another 6 years, on our 26 years, kind of already in and underway in systems. Now, as we I know we're part of our desire is to get sort of a little bit back on schedule, so we're going to shorten part of the Q&A piece. But there's a couple of pieces I'd like to pick up on, the pieces that we've discussed. It's easy to go on and go and say, like, here are these places, here are these opportunities. But, Russell, and speaking on behalf of the entire investor, insurance, and asset management community, how's that for putting a big burden on one person's shoulders? The reality is there's also a fiduciary duty that's part of the decision-making system that needs to be adhered to. How does that fiduciary role play out in being able to step into some of the sorts of, and I raise this very specifically because there's a lot of focus on carbon and being able to deal with carbon directly and being able to say, okay, we've got things there. But the fields that both Julie and Ken have put in is the value that biodiversity, the value that ecological systems have, the value that something as humble and muddy as soil has, i.e. things that have not being considered bankable. How does a fiduciary duty role and the investor and asset management role be able to square this kind of circle? Any insights?
I think to Ken's point, it's something that you could walk into a bank and they won't understand how it works, and I think it still happens today. One of the biggest problems you have is there is a disjunct between the horizon a CEO has in its tenure and 2050. I think.
What's your average CEO horizon?
I think it's about 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
So
they're not even making 2030, in other words.
Well, some of them do, depending on when
but I
they
mean,
start.
3 to 5 years is sort of 6 years is just outside that, right?
Yeah. And I think to that point, it's also the same where in terms of your executives itself, right? The rest of the team, where most of them will not be around to look at how the company performs in 2030, let alone 2050. And therefore, because of that, I can set a target without actually adhering to a target. That's my successor or the successor's problem to be have. By then, I'll retired or moved on to another business. And I think that's, while it has the level of awareness has increased, I think what is often the missing piece is how do you square that circle, right? Which you've asked, and I don't have the answer, sadly. I think you could try and commercialize things. The best way that happens is through a public-private partnership, or in some way where the regulators implement policies that attract or incentivize that partnership itself. And I think one of the problems that, at least at where I sit, we kind of see is a lot of governments say that we need to first and foremost understand, we need to first and foremost conduct a study. But the problem is to set up a project that would be functioning in 2030 today, in 2030, you first and foremost actually need to start construction yesterday, right? And I think we're behind that. So by the time you complete a study that takes 2 years, you would technically be only looking to implement a project closer to 2035 than 2030. And I think we don't have the luxury of time. So to what Ken was saying earlier, there's certain countries that have taken the proactive approach without the full gamut of information. So it's asymmetric information, right? But they take that gamble nonetheless, because you do have to make informed choices today.
We have to make choices that are informed by a different data set than we have historically done. You know, there's information out there, and we're down to having to do the last 30 seconds on each of us, so it's going to be a real challenge, because I know we could take this a lot deeper and longer. Ken, your last 30 seconds, Julie, your last 30 seconds, then Russell, you're going to get about 10, and I will probably have about 10.
Can I give you an example of a country that's actually doing that kind of thing? So we partnered with China, we partnered with the country of Jordan, we partnered with other government agencies for programs that evaluate at scale. So one of the most important resources left on the planet, organic resource, is human waste. Nobody wants to talk about it, but there's lots of it. We've partnered with the country of Jordan to evaluate that at scale. How do you use that back as an agricultural input safely and not damage the soil? Another piece of that is, if you're looking at opportunities, plant species get weaker and weaker every time you grow them, just like animal species do. They degrade genetically over time, and you've got to keep replacing that or it dies out. There are species available that are thousands of years old that are able to be grown now, and in the Middle East, we are doing that. We're actually growing species that were 3,500, 4,000 years old that are now back into production. That's the kind of thing that can be invested in. That's a real easy one.
Yeah. And things that don't necessarily take 10 years to get actually out and done. So that's very, very powerful. Julie, I know it's tight.
I'd like to reinforce also what Ken is saying. I mean, the planet is losing 12 million hectares of arable soil, arable land each year. That's an area the size of Greece. And as Russell just said, we don't have the luxury of time, but we do know that there are so many opportunities for us to invest in sustainable food and agri systems, technology, seeds, the soils themselves. Some of them, there's a variety of these. I think a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, but how do we finance the transition? This is a very valid and challenging question, with the assumption that automatically there will be a dip in yields before you have an increase again. And what we found from our experience is that sometimes that's the case and sometimes it's not. So we shouldn't just make this assumption. We can find there are systems where an investment today has an impact in healthy soils, has an impact on the yields and the quality. And all of this can translate also into access to markets for sustainable products. We've seen this for our sustainable rice from Vietnam. We've seen this for our sustainable and regen agri cotton from Cote d'Ivoire. We were able to implement these practices, have immediate results for the farmers' productivity, but also give them access to global markets that could help reward their products. But we have to keep on finding that sort of opportunity across different supply chains.
Okay, we've got the very, very subtle hint, say, stop now. So let me say thank you very, very much, Julie. Thank you very, very much, Ken. And thank you very, very much, Russell, for a topic that I know could be taken longer, as every other piece of wisdom has. So thank you all. And thank you very much for having us here today.
I wish to thank the panelists for these inputs on sustainability. I ask them to move to the center of the stage in order to receive a token of appreciation by Mr. Rajiv Batra, CEO of Rabite, and Ms. Nomita from Sun Media.